I accidentally overheard my daughter's fiancé telling his father at the wedding, "I will expose that pathetic old man in front of everyone. He will sign everything over just to save face." I did not argue. I did not burst into the room. I just smiled, walked to my car, and made one phone call. On the wedding day, as Trent stood at the altar ready to execute his master plan, I handed them 2 envelopes. The moment they opened them, their arrogant faces turned completely pale. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a former commercial construction manager from Chicago, and I am still recovering from the ultimate betrayal by the people I thought would protect my daughter." Before I continue this story and tell you exactly what was in those envelopes, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to greedy people who underestimated your worth and tried to take advantage of your kindness. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. It was a crisp Friday evening in downtown Chicago. The crystal chandeliers of the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom cast a golden glow over the room. I had just paid $40,000 for this engagement party. My daughter Harper looked radiant. She was 32, a talented interior designer, but completely blinded by her love for Trent Lawson. Trent presented himself as a high-end wealth manager from a prestigious old money family. His father, Preston Lawson, walked around the room with his nose in the air, swirling a glass of expensive single malt scotch. Preston acted as though he owned the building, a building my company had actually helped renovate 20 years ago with sweat and calloused hands. I needed a moment of quiet. The jazz band was loud, the room was crowded, and my old bones ached from a lifetime of standing on concrete floors. I slipped away from the main hall and walked down the quiet marble corridor toward the restrooms. As I approached the heavy mahogany door of the men's lounge, I heard voices echoing from inside. Not just any voices. It was Trent and his father, Preston. They were laughing. It was a deep, mocking laughter that immediately made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped dead in my tracks. I pressed my hand against the cold wood of the door, holding my breath, listening intently. "Can you believe this extravagant spread?" Preston was saying, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "The stupid bricklayer really went all out. He has way too much cash and absolutely zero class. Did you see the suit he is wearing tonight? It looks like he bought it off a discount rack." My stomach tightened into a cold knot. The stupid bricklayer. That was me. They were talking about me. 40 years of pouring concrete, negotiating brutal contracts, and building a commercial construction empire with my bare hands, all reduced to a sneer by a man who had never done a hard day of physical labor in his entire life. I had sacrificed so much to build a secure life for my late wife, Martha, and our daughter, Harper. Then Trent laughed. It was a cold, calculating, and vicious sound. "Let the old man enjoy his little party, Dad. He is paying for it after all. But do not worry. I have everything lined up for the wedding day. When the time comes, I will expose that pathetic old man in front of everyone. I have the medical papers ready. He will be so humiliated and confused he will sign everything over just to save face. We will have total control of the entire Caldwell estate before they even cut the cake." My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. "Expose me, sign everything over." My mind immediately raced back to yesterday afternoon. Just 24 hours ago, I had sat in my home office and wired $200,000 directly into Trent's bank account. He had convinced Harper that they needed to secure their dream condo in Lincoln Park immediately. He promised me he would handle all the legal paperwork to ensure it was a joint asset. He looked me straight in the eye and told me it was a brilliant investment for their future. I gave him the money, because I wanted my daughter to have a perfect, stress-free start to her marriage. And now, standing outside this restroom, the pieces began to click together in my mind in a truly sickening way. I did not push the door open. The old Rick, the guy who used to yell at lazy subcontractors on freezing Chicago mornings, would have kicked that door off its hinges right then and there. I would have dragged them both out into the lobby by their expensive silk ties. But I am not that man anymore. I am older, wiser, and much more calculating. I knew that if I confronted them now without solid proof, Trent would just deny it. He would smoothly lie his way out of it and play the victim. Harper would think I was just a crazy, jealous old father trying to ruin her happiness. I needed absolute leverage. I needed to destroy them completely. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit. I forced my racing heart to slow down to a steady, rhythmic beat. I plastered a warm, clueless, grandfatherly smile on my face. Then I pushed the heavy door open and walked in, heading straight for the marble sinks as if I had not heard a single word of their toxic conversation. Trent and Preston froze instantly. Their cruel laughter died in their throats. Preston nearly spilled his expensive scotch all over his imported Italian leather shoes. Trent quickly adjusted his tie, his eyes darting toward me in a panic, desperately trying to gauge how long I had been standing outside that door. "Oh, hey, Rick," Trent said, his voice suddenly smooth as butter, dripping with that fake charm he used to manipulate my daughter. "We were just talking about you." I turned on the gold faucet and began washing my hands, looking at them through the mirror. "Is that so?" I asked, keeping my tone light and friendly. "I hope it was all good things. What are you two planning in here?" Trent did not miss a beat. He stepped forward and placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "Dad, we were just debating how to properly honor you at the center of the wedding ceremony. You have sacrificed so much for Harper and for us. We want to make sure everyone knows what a generous, incredible man you are." Preston nodded along, eagerly recovering his arrogant composure. "Absolutely, Richard. We are so proud to merge our families. You truly are a pillar of this community." I dried my hands on a soft towel, smiling right back at them. "That is very kind of you both. I am really looking forward to the big day." I walked out of the restroom, leaving them to their false sense of security. But as I walked back into the bright ballroom, my gut was screaming. My 40 years in the cutthroat construction business told me I was looking at two dangerous con artists. The way Trent's left eye twitched slightly when he lied the over-rehearsed tone of his voice, it was a massive red flag. I looked across the room at Harper, laughing with her friends, completely oblivious to the snake she was about to marry. I could not let this happen. I would not let them steal her future or my legacy. The moment this party ended, the real work was going to begin. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in deception. I had to sit at the head table sipping sparkling water, while Trent stood up and gave a toast. He raised his glass to me, his smile perfectly bright, telling the entire room how much he admired my work ethic. I watched the crowd applaud. I watched my daughter look at him with absolute adoration. Every time he spoke about family values, I thought about the conversation in the restroom. I thought about the way his left eye had twitched. That tiny, almost imperceptible spasm. In the construction business, you learn to read a man by what he tries to hide, not what he shows you. When a subcontractor is lying about the quality of concrete, his voice gets a little too smooth. Trent was entirely too smooth. Preston was far too polished. By midnight, the party began to wind down. The valet brought my car around to the front of the Ritz-Carlton. Harper ran up to me, her expensive gown swishing softly against the pavement. She wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, thanking me for the perfect night. I held my little girl, feeling a sudden, terrifying wave of protectiveness. Trent came up right behind her, placing a possessive hand on her shoulder. He reached out and shook my hand firmly. "Thank you again, Rick," he said, his voice dripping with that same artificial warmth. "We could not have done this without you. We will see you tomorrow to go over the catering numbers." I smiled back, looking him dead in the eye. "You can count on it, Trent. Have a good night." I got into my car and pulled away from the hotel. The drive back to my dark, empty house in the quiet suburbs was a long blur of glowing streetlights and dark thoughts. My mind kept returning to the wire transfer. $200,000. the down payment for their beautiful sunlit condo in Lincoln Park. Trent had insisted on handling the closing himself. He claimed it was a surprise for Harper that he wanted to manage the heavy lifting so she could focus on the wedding plans. I had trusted him because my daughter loved him. That was my first mistake. You never hand over a sum like that without running a title search. I had gotten soft in my retirement. But the predator in me, the man who built an empire from dirt and steel, was fully awake now. I pulled into my driveway and walked past the dark living room into my home office. I did not bother turning on the main lights. The glow of the computer monitor was enough. I sat down in my heavy leather chair and flexed my stiff fingers. I opened the web browser and navigated straight to the Cook County Public Property Registry. Anyone can look up a deed if they know the address and are willing to pay the digital search fee. I typed in the address of the Lincoln Park condo. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as the loading icon spun on the screen. The document appeared. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. I looked for Harper Caldwell. I looked for Trent Lawson. Neither of those names appeared anywhere on the deed. The property had been purchased 2 days ago, just as Trent had claimed. But the recorded owner was not my daughter. It was an entity called Horizon Trust Management Limited Liability Company. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. An LLC. He had used my money to buy the condo under a corporate shield. Harper had zero legal claim to that property. She was essentially a tenant in a home I had paid for, but the sickness in my stomach told me there was more to find. I clicked the next tab on the county website to check for any liens or encumbrances attached to the property. The screen refreshed, and the truth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. A second mortgage had been recorded against the condo. 48 hours after the initial purchase, a new loan for $150,000 had been taken out against the equity. Trent had not just used my $200,000 to buy the house. He had immediately turned around and used the property as collateral to pull out a massive sum of cash. My own hard-earned money was completely gone. The equity was gone. The condo was leveraged to the hilt. I sat back in the chair, the silence of the house pressing heavily against my ears. The plausible lie he had told me in the restroom earlier that evening echoed in my mind. We were just debating how to properly honor you. It was not just arrogance. It was a calculated financial extraction. He was systematically draining my resources and isolating my daughter. He had stripped the down payment, burdened the house with debt, and left my daughter Harper dangerously exposed. And according to what I heard in that restroom, this was only the beginning. He was planning something much larger for the wedding day involving medical papers. He wanted total control of the Caldwell estate. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook. I opened to a fresh page and picked up my pen. I was not going to yell. I was not going to throw a pointless tantrum. I was going to systematically dismantle the entire Lawson family piece by piece. I wrote down 2 specific names. Bradley, my ruthless corporate lawyer. Victor, the best forensic financial investigator in the state of Illinois. Tomorrow morning, I would unleash both of them. Trent Lawson thought he was playing a game with a clueless old man. He was just about to find out exactly how a Chicago bricklayer destroys a foundation. The clock on my desk read 2 in the morning, but sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. My blood was running too hot. I kept staring at the 2 names I had just written in my leather-bound notebook, but my mind kept pulling me back to the glowing computer monitor. The initial shock of seeing the fraudulent property deed had started to fade, replaced by a cold and calculating anger. I leaned forward and placed my hands on the keyboard. If Trent Lawson thought he had covered his tracks by using a basic corporate shield, he was vastly underestimating my experience. In the commercial construction world, shell companies are used every day to hide liabilities and dodge union disputes. I knew exactly how to peel back those layers. I opened a new tab on my web browser and accessed the Illinois Secretary of State Business Database. I typed in Horizon Trust Management Limited Liability Company. The search results populated instantly. The registered agent was a generic legal service firm located in a strip mall in Springfield. That was standard practice for anyone trying to remain anonymous. But amateurs always leave a digital paper trail. I scrolled down to the annual reporting section and requested the original articles of organization. It cost me an extra $50 in processing fees. But the document appeared on my screen within minutes. I magnified the PDF file and scanned the fine print at the bottom of the page. There, listed as the sole managing member of the entity, was Preston Lawson. My jaw tightened. The father and son were working together in a coordinated financial scheme. Trent had taken my $200,000, funneled it through his father's dummy corporation, and used it to purchase the condo outright. Then, less than 48 hours later, they had leveraged that fully paid property to secure a new loan for $150,000. But why wealthy men who manage prestigious family funds do not need to take out emergency second mortgages on residential real estate? They certainly do not need to steal from their future father-in-law to generate liquid cash. The terrible truth settled over me like a heavy winter fog. This was never an investment for Harper's future. It was a bailout. Trent was bleeding money. He was drowning in some kind of severe debt, and he had targeted my family to keep himself afloat. He had identified me as a wealthy, grieving widower who would do absolutely anything to make his only daughter happy. He saw my unconditional love for Harper, not as a beautiful thing, but as an endless line of credit. He needed that $200,000 desperately, and he needed the subsequent loan even more. The engagement, the lavish party, the charming smiles, it was all an elaborate performance to gain access to the Caldwell bank accounts. I pushed my chair away from the desk and stood up. The room felt entirely too small. I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark, silent street. The neighborhood was completely still, but a violent storm was raging inside my chest. I thought about my daughter sleeping peacefully in her apartment across the city, dreaming about flower arrangements and wedding dresses, completely unaware that she was marrying a financial predator. My first instinct, the protective father instinct, was to drive over to her place right now, wake her up and show her the documents. I wanted to shake her and tell her to pack her bags, but I forced myself to stand perfectly still. I took a deep breath of the cool air leaking through the window frame. If I went to Harper now with nothing but a property deed and a hunch about Trent's financial problems, I would lose her. She was deeply in love. Trent would easily spin a new lie. He would tell her that the corporate structure was standard wealth management practice, and he would accuse me of invading their privacy and trying to control their marriage. He would play the injured victim, and Harper would rally to his side. In my haste to protect her, I would only succeed in pushing her right into his arms. If you want to take down a structurally compromised building, you do not just hit it with a sledgehammer. You study the load-bearing walls. You strategically place your explosives. You make sure that when the collapse happens, it falls exactly where you want it to, leaving the surrounding structures completely untouched. I needed to let Trent continue building his house of cards. I needed to let him feel invincible. Only then could I expose him so completely that Harper would never doubt the truth. I spent the next 3 hours printing every single document, every public record, and every related filing I could find. I organized them into neat chronological stacks on my desk. By the time the sky outside my window began to turn a pale, bruised purple, I had a preliminary dossier of fraud. The sun slowly crested over the horizon, casting long shadows across my home office. I walked into the kitchen, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and poured myself a large mug. I did not feel tired. I felt a sharp, dangerous clarity. At exactly 7 in the morning, I picked up my cell phone. I did not care if I was waking them up. I dialed the first number in my notebook. Bradley answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gruff with sleep. I cut him off before he could say hello. "Bradley," I said, my voice low and steady. I need you and Victor at my house by 9 o'clock this morning. Cancel your other appointments for the entire week. We are going to war right now. I need you to completely and totally, financially ruin the manipulative man my daughter is about to marry before it is too late. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on my desk. The wheels were finally in motion, but I knew legal investigations took time. I needed to know exactly where my daughter stood right now. I needed to look her in the eyes and see just how deeply Trent had buried his lies into her mind. I picked up my phone again and dialed Harper's number. She answered with a bright, cheerful voice, the sound of a woman who thought she had the entire world at her fingertips. I kept my tone light, playing the role of the doting father, and asked if she wanted to grab a quick coffee before her morning appointments. She eagerly agreed, suggesting her favorite little bakery just a few blocks from her apartment. An hour later, I was sitting across from her at a small iron table on the sidewalk. The morning sun was warming the Chicago streets, and Harper looked absolutely radiant. She was practically vibrating with excitement, laying out fabric swatches and catering menus on the table between our coffee cups. She talked about imported orchids and silk ribbons with such pure joy that it made my heart ache physically. I sat there sipping my black coffee, nodding and smiling at all the right moments. But beneath the table, my hands were curled into tight fists. I waited for a natural pause in her rapid-fire planning. When she stopped to take a breath and sip her latte, I made my move. "So, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice incredibly casual, "how did the closing go on the new place? Did everything go smoothly with the paperwork? I just want to make sure the title company did not give you any unnecessary headaches." Harper waved her hand dismissively, a soft, untroubled smile on her face. "Oh, Dad, it was entirely painless. Trent is honestly amazing. He handled all the heavy, boring legal stuff so I could focus on finalizing the reception details. He said the traditional way of buying a house is outdated and leaves you exposed to too many taxes. So he set up this special thing called an asset protection trust. He said all the old money families use it. It is supposed to shield the property and keep our future investments completely private. He just had me sign a few authorization forms, and he took care of the rest." I kept the pleasant smile plastered on my face even as the blood pounded fiercely in my ears. An asset protection trust. It was a beautiful, sophisticated lie. A perfect piece of corporate jargon designed to sound protective while completely stripping her of her legal rights. He had convinced her that being excluded from the deed to her own home was a privilege. I took a slow, measured sip of my coffee to buy myself a few seconds. "That sounds very complex," I said softly. "I am glad he is looking out for your financial future. Speaking of which, have you two discussed how you are handling your personal assets?" Harper laughed, a light, carefree sound that grated against my nerves. "Actually, we sorted that out yesterday. It was so funny, Dad. We were sitting in the living room completely buried under a mountain of floral arrangement contracts and catering agreements. We were just trying to get through the massive pile of signatures. Trent slipped the prenup right in the middle of the stack. He joked that since we were already signing our lives away to the florist, we might as well get the legal stuff out of the way too. It was just standard boilerplate text to keep the trust fund separate from our joint checking account. I just skimmed it and signed at the bottom. It saved us from having to sit in a stuffy lawyer's office. My stomach plummeted into an icy abyss. A prenuptial agreement mixed in with floral contracts. He had purposely buried a legally binding financial document within a stack of wedding vendor agreements. He had waited until she was exhausted, distracted, and overwhelmed by the stress of wedding planning to have her sign away her legal protections. She had not had a lawyer review it. She had not even read it properly. He had framed it as a casual joke. I knew with absolute certainty that the document she signed was not standard boilerplate text. It was a carefully crafted trap designed to saddle her with his hidden debts and give him unrestricted access to her future inheritance. Every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to slam my fist down on the iron table. I wanted to grab the fabric swatches and throw them into the street. I wanted to look her directly in the eyes and tell her that the man she loved was a predatory monster. I wanted to drag her to my car drive to the county clerk and show her the fraudulent deed and the second mortgage. The words were burning the back of my throat, desperate to be spoken. But I looked at her glowing face, her eyes shining with absolute trust and innocent excitement. If I told her the truth right now without undeniable proof, I would lose her. Trent had laid his psychological groundwork flawlessly. He had positioned himself as her protector. If I accused him of fraud based on a single county record, Trent would smoothly pivot. He would tell Harper that her father was a controlling man who could not handle letting another man take care of his daughter. Harper would be forced to choose. She would push me away, and I would be entirely cut out of her life. I had to swallow the bitter taste of rage. I had to let her continue walking toward the edge of the cliff, knowing I was secretly building a net at the bottom. I forced my shoulders to relax, offered her a warm smile, and slowly nodded my head in quiet agreement. I forced my shoulders to relax, offered her a warm smile, and slowly nodded my head in quiet agreement. After finishing my coffee, I walked Harper to her car, hugged her tightly, and watched her drive away toward her bridal fitting. My smile vanished the exact second her taillights turned the corner. I climbed into my own vehicle, the heavy door slamming shut like a vault, sealing me inside with my anger. I headed straight toward the West Loop, leaving the polished streets behind for the grittier corridors of the industrial sector. This was my territory. I pulled into a subterranean parking garage beneath an unmarked concrete building. I had owned this building for 20 years. It housed no public businesses, only private suites, for the kind of meetings that required absolute discretion. I parked my car, grabbed my briefcase, and walked toward the steel elevator doors. I was completely ready. I rode the elevator up to the 4th floor. The heavy doors slid open, revealing a stark, minimalist conference room. Sitting at the long oak table were the two most dangerous men I had on my private payroll. On the left was Bradley. He was a ruthless corporate litigator who wore expensive Italian suits and possessed the moral flexibility of a starving shark. On the right sat Victor. He wore a faded gray sweater and round spectacles, looking like a tired professor. But Victor was a former federal forensic auditor. He could find a single hidden dollar in a complex maze of shell companies. They were drinking black coffee, waiting in total silence. I did not offer them pleasantries. I walked straight to the head of the table. I opened my briefcase and dropped the thick stack of printed county records right in the center of the wood. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing slightly against the bare walls. "I need to dismantle a man, and I need to do it before my daughter marries him next Saturday." Bradley leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. He did not look surprised. He had spent decades watching me crush rival contractors who tried to cheat me out of money. "Who is the target, Rick? His name is Trent Lawson," I replied, sliding the first printed document across the table. "And his father, Preston Lawson. They are currently parading around Chicago society playing the roles of a wealthy elite family. Trent claims to be a high-level wealth manager. Preston acts like he practically owns the entire city. Yesterday, I wired Trent $200,000 to purchase a luxury condo for my daughter. Last night, I pulled the property records from the county database. He bought the unit using an anonymous limited liability company managed secretly by his father. Then, barely 48 hours later, he took out a second mortgage for $150,000 against the equity of the home. My daughter has absolutely zero legal claim to the property." Victor adjusted his glasses, pulling the documents closer to his face. His pale eyes scanned the small print with mechanical speed. "This is incredibly sloppy work," Victor murmured, his voice soft and raspy. "Using a family member as a registered agent on a shell company while committing real estate fraud is amateur hour. If he is a legitimate wealth manager, he is a remarkably desperate one. A professional would have layered this transaction through at least 3 offshore trusts before pulling the cash out. He is desperate," I confirmed, pacing slowly behind my chair. This morning I found out he also slipped a fraudulent prenuptial agreement into a massive stack of floral contracts. He tricked Harper into signing the document without any legal counsel. He is clearly trying to attach her to whatever financial disaster he is currently running from, and he wants control over her future inheritance. I need to know exactly what he is hiding. I stopped pacing and placed both of my hands firmly on the table, leaning in close to the two men. I want the Lawson family stripped down to their absolute bare financial bones. Leave no stone unturned. I want every single bank statement, every credit report, and every tax return filed in the last 10 years. I want to know where Trent actually works, or if he even works at all. I want to know who holds his debts. I want a complete accounting of Preston Lawson and his supposed medical career. If they have a single dime hidden in a shoebox in a dark basement, I want a high-resolution photograph of that shoebox. Bradley pulled a silver pen from his inside pocket and began writing swiftly on a yellow legal pad. What is our timeline? Rick. Financial deep dives usually take weeks to execute properly, especially if we have to subpoena sealed bank records. We do not have weeks, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet whisper. The wedding is exactly next Saturday. I cannot let her walk down that church aisle, but I also cannot confront him without an absolute mountain of undeniable proof. If I accuse him now, he will just spin another charming lie and Harper will take his side. I need you to build me a weapon so powerful that he will have absolutely no choice but to surrender. Break every privacy rule you have to break. Call in every favor you have ever accumulated in this city. I do not care how much it costs or who you have to bribe. I will write you a blank check right now. Just get me the absolute truth. Victor closed the file folder and looked up at me. His mild professor-like demeanor was completely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of an apex predator who had just caught the scent of blood in the water. Consider them exposed, Mr. Caldwell. By tomorrow evening, we will find the rot. Trent Lawson picked the wrong man to rob. The next 24 hours dragged by with an agonizing slowness. I tried to go about my normal routine, watering the plants, organizing my garage, but my mind was completely consumed by the impending storm. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart hammered against my ribs. Finally, at exactly 6 o'clock on Friday evening, the heavy oak doors of my home office swung open. Victor walked in first, holding a massive, thick manila envelope that looked heavy enough to break a man's wrist. Bradley followed closely behind him, his usually calm face pulled tight into a grim, unreadable expression. They did not sit down. Victor simply walked over to my desk and dropped the heavy envelope directly onto the center of the leather blotter. It landed with a loud, heavy thud that seemed to echo through the entire room. We found the rot, Victor said softly, and it is much deeper than we originally thought. I reached out and pulled the envelope toward me. My hands were perfectly steady. The anger had burned off hours ago, leaving behind a cold, mechanical focus. I unclasped the metal binding and pulled out the thick stack of papers. The top document was a federal court filing from the Northern District of Illinois. I stared at the bold black letters printed across the top of the page. It was a Chapter 7 bankruptcy petition. The name on the filing was Preston Lawson. The date was exactly 5 years ago. I looked up at Victor. You mean to tell me this wealthy elite family is entirely broke? Victor nodded slowly, adjusting his glasses. They are worse than broke. They are a financial black hole. Preston Lawson lost the entire family fortune half a decade ago in a series of incredibly stupid real estate speculations. The old money they love to brag about is completely gone. They have been living off a complex web of high-interest personal loans, maxed-out credit cards, and the rapidly dwindling charity of a few naive friends who still believe the Lawson name means something in this city. That explains the rented luxury cars and the leased designer suits, I murmured, flipping to the next page in the dossier. But what about the son? What about Trent? Bradley stepped forward, resting his hands on the edge of my desk. Trent is not a wealth manager, Rick. That is a complete fabrication. Until 8 months ago, he was a mid-level broker at a secondary firm downtown. He was fired with cause. He engaged in unauthorized high-risk margin trading using client funds. The firm quietly let him go to avoid a massive public scandal, but they slapped him with a staggering penalty. Trent currently owes his former brokerage firm, along with several aggressive private lenders, nearly $4 million. He is drowning in margin debt, and they are threatening to take him to court to liquidate everything he touches. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. $4 million. My $200,000 condo down payment was not even a drop in the bucket for a man in that kind of desperate financial trouble. He had targeted my daughter because he viewed my construction fortune as a massive life raft. Bradley reached out and gently pulled the bankruptcy records aside, revealing a neatly stapled, heavily dense legal document underneath. And it gets much worse, Rick. We managed to pull a copy of the prenuptial agreement Trent slipped into those floral contracts. You need to understand that this document is a masterpiece of predatory legal writing. He drafted it specifically to look like a standard asset protection form, but the clauses buried in the 9th section are completely toxic. I looked down at the paper, my eyes scanning the dense paragraphs. "Translate it for me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. Bradley pointed to a long paragraph near the bottom of the page. If Harper marries him with this document in place, she legally absorbs half of his current liabilities. The moment she says "I do," she becomes personally responsible for $2 million of his hidden margin debt. He is legally transferring his financial ruin directly onto her shoulders. But that is not even the most sinister part of the agreement. Turn to the final page, Rick. Look at the clause regarding future inheritances. I flipped the page, my vision narrowing as I read the complex legal phrasing. It was dense, but the underlying meaning was horrifyingly clear. If I die, or if I am ever declared medically incompetent, Trent is immediately granted full administrative rights over Harper's inheritance. He would have unchecked power to liquidate my properties, drain my investment accounts, and funnel every single penny of my life's work directly into his own pockets to pay off his massive debts. He was not just trying to steal a house or ruin my daughter's credit score. Trent Lawson was actively plotting to consume the entire Caldwell estate. He wanted to wipe out everything I had built for 40 years. The room fell into absolute silence. The only sound was the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I slowly closed the file and rested my hands flat against the leather cover. My daughter was deeply in love with a man who was building a financial coffin for her, and she was going to smile while she laid down inside it. Bradley and Victor watched me carefully, waiting for my reaction. I did not scream or panic. I did not throw the heavy file across the room in a blind rage. I just took a deep breath, composed myself, and looked directly at them both. "We are going to buy his outstanding debt," I said softly. "I want to acquire every single penny of it. Prepare the necessary legal paperwork immediately, without any delay. I want to completely own this man before the wedding day arrives." The meeting with Bradley and Victor concluded with a cold, absolute certainty. I spent the rest of the weekend pacing the hardwood floors of my empty house, waiting for the legal machinery to quietly lock into place. By Tuesday morning, the storm outside had broken, leaving the Chicago suburbs bathed in a crisp, deceptive sunlight. I was in the kitchen pouring a second cup of coffee and reviewing a stack of preliminary debt acquisition contracts when the sudden chime of the front doorbell shattered the quiet. I glanced at the security monitor mounted on the wall. Standing on my front porch, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blazer and holding a small silver gift bag, was Trent Lawson. I quickly shoved the legal documents into a kitchen drawer, smoothed my expression into a mask of pleasant surprise, and walked down the hallway to open the heavy oak door. Trent flashed me a brilliant white smile that did not quite reach his cold eyes. "Rick," he said, his voice dripping with an exaggerated syrupy warmth, "I am so sorry to drop by completely unannounced. I was just in the neighborhood meeting with a few high-net-worth clients, and I wanted to check in on you." I opened the door wider and gestured for him to step inside. "Not at all, Trent. Come on in. I was just having my morning coffee. Can I get you a cup?" He waved his hand dismissively and stepped into the foyer, looking around my home with the calculating gaze of a thief appraising a museum. "No thank you, Rick. I actually cannot stay long. But I brought you a little something." He reached into the silver bag and pulled out a heavy dark glass bottle. I took it from him and looked at the label. It was a ridiculously expensive brand of premium cognitive enhancement supplements, the kind they aggressively market to elderly executives. I looked back up at him, raising an eyebrow in feigned confusion. "Vitamins?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "I appreciate the gesture, Trent, but my doctor says I am as healthy as a horse." Trent let out a soft, condescending chuckle and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Of course you are physically healthy, Rick. You are a rock. But you have been under a tremendous amount of stress lately with all the wedding planning. And to be completely honest, Harper and I have been getting a little bit worried about you." I kept my face perfectly still, but my pulse immediately quickened. "Worried?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Whatever for?" Trent sighed, adopting a deeply convincing look of sympathetic concern. He lowered his voice, speaking to me as if I were a fragile child. "Well, you have been forgetting things recently, Rick. Small things, of course, but it adds up. For example, the final catering deposit for the Ritz. The vendor called me in a panic yesterday morning because the invoice was 3 weeks past due. They were threatening to cancel the entire reception menu." My mind flashed back to the catering bill. I had specifically asked Trent for that invoice a month ago. He had told me he was handling the vendor negotiations and would email the final payment link directly to my accountant. He never sent it. He had intentionally withheld the invoice, let it go past due, and was now using his own manufactured crisis to gaslight me in my own hallway. I did not defend myself. I did not tell him that my memory was sharper than a diamond cutter. I just let a look of mild, bewildered panic cross my face. "Oh my goodness," I stammered, rubbing my forehead. "Did I really miss that? I could have sworn I asked you to send that over?" Trent squeezed my shoulder tighter. "It is perfectly fine, Rick. I took care of it out of my own pocket. I did not want Harper to stress about it, but it just got me thinking. You have worked so incredibly hard your entire life. Your mind has carried the weight of a massive company for decades. It is completely natural for things to start slipping a little bit at this stage. That is why I spoke to my father this morning. Preston has pulled some strings at his clinic. He wants you to come in tomorrow afternoon for a comprehensive VIP cognitive checkup. No waiting rooms, no hassle. Just a quick evaluation to make sure everything is firing correctly. It would give Harper so much peace of mind." The sheer audacity of the trap was breathtaking. Standing right there in my foyer, the entire sinister architecture of their plan finally revealed itself. The purposely missing invoices, the ridiculously expensive brain pills, the fake concern, and now the VIP medical appointment with his corrupt father. They were not just trying to steal a few $100,000. They were meticulously building a documented medical paper trail to prove I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. If Preston officially diagnosed me with dementia, Trent could immediately trigger the medical incompetency clause hidden in the prenuptial agreement. He would use his father's forged medical records to seize total legal control of my entire estate. He was trying to financially euthanize me. I looked at the bottle of pills in my hand, feeling a surge of pure, violent rage coursing through my veins. I forced my shoulders to slump slightly. I let out a long, tired sigh. "You know, Trent," I said softly, staring down at the floor. "Maybe you are right. The wedding stress has been a bit overwhelming. I have been feeling a little foggy lately. I would really appreciate it if Preston could fit me in." Trent smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile of absolute victory. "That is wonderful, Rick. I will make sure to text you the exact address. Do not worry about a single thing today." We are going to take excellent care of you, Rick. The next afternoon, I stood before my bedroom mirror adjusting my tweed jacket. I needed to look exactly like the man they thought I was, an aging widower slowly losing his grip. But the most important part of my wardrobe was tucked neatly into my breast pocket. It was a heavy silver pen. Victor had delivered it to my mailbox late last night. It looked like a standard luxury pen, but the cap housed a voice-activated micro-recorder. I clicked the top once, verifying the tiny blue light that flashed briefly before turning invisible. Every syllable spoken today would be captured as federal evidence. I walked out to my car and drove toward the medical district. Trent's address led to a boutique private clinic on the top floor of a glass building. It catered exclusively to wealthy clients. I rode the silent elevator up. The waiting room resembled a luxury hotel lobby. Before I could speak to the receptionist, Preston emerged through frosted glass doors. He was wearing a crisp white medical coat over his tailored suit, looking every inch the distinguished, caring physician. "Richard." "My dear friend," he said warmly, extending both of his hands to grasp mine. "I am so glad Trent was able to convince you to come in today. Please come straight back to my personal office. We do not need to bother with the waiting room out here." I offered him a weak, slightly trembling smile and followed him down the quiet hallway. He ushered me into a spacious, sunlit examination room that smelled faintly of expensive leather and antiseptic. I sat down heavily in the chair opposite his large mahogany desk. I casually pulled the silver pen from my pocket and set it down on the edge of the desk, pointing the hidden microphone directly at his face. "I just brought my pen in case I needed to fill out any complicated insurance forms," I mumbled, rubbing my eyes as if I were exhausted. Preston chuckled softly, sitting down behind his desk and folding his hands together. "Oh, do not worry about any paperwork, Richard. We are family now. This is completely off the books. Trent just mentioned that you have been seeming a bit overwhelmed lately. We just want to run through a very standard, very simple cognitive baseline test. It is completely painless, I promise you." I nodded slowly, letting my shoulders slump forward to project a sense of quiet defeat. "Thank you, Preston. I suppose my mind has been a little foggy these past few weeks. The wedding planning has been quite a lot to handle." Preston offered me a look of deep, practiced sympathy. His eyes were perfectly warm, but I could see the cold calculation hiding just beneath the surface. "Completely understandable," he murmured soothingly. "Let us just do a few basic exercises. I am going to ask you some very simple questions, and I just want you to answer as best as you can." He picked up a clipboard and clicked his own pen. "Let us start with something easy. Can you tell me your current address and perhaps your cell phone number?" I stared blankly at the wall behind him for a few long seconds, letting the silence stretch out uncomfortably in the room. I recited my street address perfectly, but then I paused. I furrowed my brow, raised my hand to massage my temples, and let out a frustrated sigh. "My phone number," I muttered, shaking my head slowly. "It is area code 312, and then—" I intentionally mixed up the middle 3 digits, reciting a number that belonged to a local dry cleaner instead of my own phone. I stopped, looked at him with wide, confused eyes, and swallowed hard. "I am sorry, Preston. I have had that number for 10 years, and it just completely slipped my mind right now. I must be tired." Preston scribbled furiously on his clipboard, the scratching sound of his pen echoing in the quiet room. "It is perfectly all right, Richard," he said, his voice dripping with an almost sickening level of false reassurance. "Do not force it. Let us try something visual. It uses a different part of the brain." He opened a drawer and pulled out 3 common objects. He placed them on the desk right next to my hidden recorder. There was a metal key, a plastic comb, and a small rubber eraser. "Can you point to the object we used to unlock a door?" he asked, speaking incredibly slowly. I reached out and tapped the metal key with my index finger. "Excellent," he praised me, treating me like a toddler who had just learned a new trick. "Now what is this second object called?" He pointed his finger directly at the plastic comb. I stared at the comb for a long time. I squinted my eyes, tilted my head, and let my breathing become slightly ragged. I know what it does, I said, my voice trembling with perfectly manufactured frustration. You use it in the morning. You use it to fix your hair. But the actual word for it, the name, it is just sitting right there on the tip of my tongue, but I simply cannot find it. I looked down at my hands, acting utterly defeated. Preston leaned forward, his face a mask of deep medical concern. He placed his hand gently over mine. It is a comb, Richard. And please take a deep breath. There is absolutely no need to panic. This is exactly why we are doing this evaluation today. For the next 20 minutes, I played the role of the fading patriarch flawlessly. Every time I faltered, Preston offered a warm smile while meticulously documenting my fabricated failures. He was constructing the medical cage they planned to lock me inside. Finally, he set his clipboard down. Richard, he whispered somberly. There are significant cognitive gaps here. We will keep this strictly between us. You can trust us. I simply nodded, thanking him with a trembling voice, and picked up my silver pen from the edge of his mahogany desk. I walked out of that pristine, sterile office, leaving him to wallow in his arrogant delusion. The drive back to my secure meeting room in the West Loop felt entirely different from my journey there. I was no longer an anxious father searching for answers in the dark. I was a man who had just handed his enemies the very rope they planned to hang him with. When I walked through the heavy steel doors of the conference room, Victor and Bradley were already waiting. I tossed the silver pen onto the center of the oak table, where it landed with a sharp clatter. The recording is pristine, I told them, taking my seat and unbuttoning my tweed jacket. He fell for the entire performance without a single moment of hesitation. But I need to know exactly what he wrote down in that official medical file. Victor did not say a word at first. He simply reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a fresh, sealed folder. As an investigator with federal auditing credentials, Victor explained, his voice low and raspy. I have lawful avenues to request immediate disclosures when investigating suspected elder financial abuse. The clinic administration transmitted these files to my secure server less than 20 minutes after you left the building. He slid the heavy folder across the polished wood table toward me. I opened it carefully, my eyes scanning the crisp white medical stationery bearing Preston Lawson's impressive professional letterhead. What I read was not a simple documentation of my supposed forgetfulness. It was a complete, calculated clinical assassination. Preston had not just written down the minor symptoms we had discussed. He had entirely fabricated a massive, devastating narrative. The file detailed months of progressive memory loss, sudden violent mood swings, and severe spatial disorientation, none of which had ever actually occurred. And at the bottom of the final page, printed in bold and undeniable ink, was his official diagnosis. Early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The sheer breathtaking maliciousness of it made my stomach churn violently. They were completely willing to erase my humanity just to get to my bank accounts. But the rot within the document went even deeper than the false diagnosis. Right next to Preston's signature was a second signature belonging to a highly prominent neurologist associated with the clinic. Victor tapped the paper with his index finger, pointing directly at the cursive loops. That second signature is a complete forgery, Victor said plainly, without a trace of emotion. We cross-referenced the doctor's schedule with international flight manifests. He is currently attending a closed medical conference in Switzerland and has been out of the country for a week. Preston signed it himself to bypass the mandatory secondary review protocol required by the state for such a severe neurological diagnosis. He wanted an absolutely airtight medical record, and he was completely willing to commit a medical felony to get it. I stared at the forged ink, the reality of their pure evil settling heavily over my shoulders. Bradley leaned forward, his hands steepled together, his eyes dark with professional disgust. Now we have the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle, Rick. It all connects perfectly back to the prenuptial agreement Harper blindly signed and the wedding ceremony scheduled for this coming Saturday. The elaborate engagement party, the rushed condo purchased, the fake vitamins, and this fraudulent medical exam. It was all a highly coordinated build-up to a single devastating public moment. Bradley opened his own briefcase and pulled out a blank legal template, sliding it next to the medical file. Trent is going to wait until the wedding reception reaches its peak. He wants a room full of your closest friends, your powerful business associates, and your entire extended family. He wants maximum social pressure and nowhere for you to hide. He is going to stand up, put on a face of absolute heartbreaking tragedy, and announce to everyone that your mind is rapidly failing. He will present this forged medical diagnosis to the crowd as his undeniable proof. Then he is going to pull out a comprehensive, durable power of attorney document. He will frame the entire situation as an act of profound love and selfless sacrifice. He will tell the stunned crowd that he is stepping up to save the family, to protect your hard-earned legacy from your own deteriorating mind. And with hundreds of people watching, swimming in a sea of manufactured sympathy, he will publicly pressure you into signing over total administrative control of your entire estate right then and there. If you refuse, you look like a confused, stubborn, sick old man aggressively fighting the people who are just trying to help him. If you sign, he legally owns everything you have ever built, and Harper is trapped forever. I sat perfectly still, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioning. They were planning to completely humiliate me in front of everyone I respected. They wanted to strip away my dignity, my wealth, and my daughter in one single calculated stroke of psychological warfare. They wanted to reduce Richard Caldwell to a helpless victim in a nursing home, while they spent my construction fortune to cover their pathetic margin debts. The silence in the room was incredibly heavy, thick with the weight of this sickening revelation. I looked at Bradley and then at Victor. The simmering anger was completely gone, replaced by an absolute freezing calm. My mind shifted gears, locking into the brutal logic I used to negotiate multi-million-dollar commercial contracts. I closed the medical file and pushed it back across the oak table. "They think they are setting a trap for an old wounded animal," I said, my voice steady and completely cold. "But they have absolutely no idea what they have actually just invited into their miserable lives." Bradley looked at me carefully, tapping his pen against the legal pad. "You could take this file straight to the police right now, Rick. Medical forgery is a serious felony. The authorities would arrest Preston before the sun goes down, and the wedding would be immediately canceled. It is the safest route." I shook my head slowly, feeling the cold certainty hardening inside my chest. "No," I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet conference room. "If I call the police today, the wedding is canceled, but Trent survives the narrative. He will hire a slick defense attorney. He will claim his father acted alone out of misguided concern for my health. He will look my daughter in the eyes and swear he knew nothing about the forged signature. He will play the tragic victim. Harper would be devastated, confused, and vulnerable. She might even stay with him out of pity. I cannot allow him any room to manipulate his way out of this. I need to crush him so completely that there is absolutely nothing left for him to ever spin again." Victor nodded slowly, a dark smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "What exactly do you want to do, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked softly. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the heavy oak table. Trent owes roughly $4 million to his former brokerage firm and several aggressive private lenders. They are threatening to liquidate him. I want to save them the trouble of a lengthy court battle. "Bradley, I want you to immediately establish a blind trust and a new limited liability company registered in Delaware. Use the highest level of corporate shielding available. I want the true ownership of this entity buried so deep that not even a federal judge could easily trace it back to me. Once the corporate structure is fully established, I am going to authorize a massive transfer of liquid funds from my primary investment accounts. Bradley began writing furiously on his yellow legal pad. "You are going to buy his debt," Bradley stated not as a question, but as a statement of profound awe. Every single penny of it, I confirmed, my voice vibrating with cold anticipation. "I want you to contact the brokerage firm and the private lenders. Tell them you represent an anonymous debt acquisition firm. Offer to buy Trent Lawson's entire margin debt portfolio for 90 cents on the dollar. These lenders are terrified that Trent is going to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy and leave them with absolutely nothing. If you offer them a guaranteed, immediate cash buyout, they will eagerly jump at the opportunity to wipe him off their balance sheets. I want those contracts drafted, signed, and legally recorded before Friday morning." Victor adjusted his glasses, pulling up the relevant financial data on his laptop screen. "We can also acquire the second mortgage he took out on the Lincoln Park condo," Victor suggested, his voice filled with dark enthusiasm. "The lender is a mid-sized regional bank. If we bundle the mortgage acquisition through the same Delaware shell company, we will control the primary lien on his residential property." I smiled, a tight, merciless expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "Do it. Buy the mortgage. Buy the margin debt. Buy every single financial obligation that miserable excuse for a man has ever signed his name to." For the next 48 hours, my home office became a war room. I did not sleep. I barely ate. I sat at my desk drinking black coffee, authorizing wire transfers that amounted to millions of dollars. I watched as the fortune I had spent 40 years building out of steel and concrete was mobilized into a digital weapon of mass destruction. It was a staggering amount of money, but to me it was worth every single cent. I was not buying debt. I was buying a noose, and I was going to wrap it tightly around Trent Lawson's neck. Bradley and his dedicated legal team aggressively negotiated with the lenders, navigating the complex financial regulations and legally transferring the ownership of Trent's liabilities to my newly minted Delaware corporation. By Thursday evening, just 2 days before the wedding, Bradley walked into my office. He looked completely exhausted, his tie loosened, and his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but he carried a thick, leather-bound portfolio in his hands. He placed it carefully on my desk and took a deep breath. "It is done, Rick," he said quietly. "Every signature has been verified. Every wire transfer has completely cleared. The Delaware Corporation officially owns 100% of Trent Lawson's financial obligations. You hold his margin debt. You hold the second mortgage on the condo. You are now his sole legal creditor. If you decide to call in these debts and he cannot pay you within 24 hours, you have the absolute legal right to freeze his bank accounts, seize his personal assets, and force him into involuntary bankruptcy." I reached out and gently placed my right hand flat against the dark leather cover of the heavy portfolio. The incredible power contained within those crisp white pages was absolute. Trent honestly thought he was a brilliant financial genius. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a clueless, aging bricklayer. He had no idea that I had quietly purchased the entire board. He was walking around Chicago, trying on expensive tuxedos, and smiling at my daughter, completely unaware that he was already financially dead. But destroying his bank accounts was only half of the battle. The money was irrelevant compared to the safety of my daughter. Before I executed him publicly at that altar, I needed to make sure Harper understood exactly who she was marrying. I needed to break her heart now in private so that Trent could never break it in the future. I picked up my cell phone, ready to make the most painful call of my life. I picked up my cell phone, ready to make the most painful call of my life. My thumb hovered over Harper's name for a long time before I finally pressed call. When she answered, her voice was a chaotic mix of stress and joy, talking about seating charts and a minor crisis with the linens. I forced myself to sound calm, like the gentle father she expected. "Harper, sweetheart," I said softly. "I found a small private garden venue just outside the city that I think would be perfect for our traditional father-daughter breakfast on the wedding morning. Can you spare an hour to drive out there with me? I really want this to be a surprise for Trent." She didn't hesitate. She was at my front door 20 minutes later, looking beautiful and bright-eyed, her mind 1,000 miles away from the darkness I was about to show her. We drove in silence for the first 15 minutes. Harper was busy on her phone answering emails from the florist, while I steered my car away from the polished glass of downtown Chicago and toward the crumbling outskirts of the industrial district. The scenery changed from luxury high-rises to boarded-up warehouses and salt-stained pavement. Harper finally looked up from her screen, her brow furrowing as she looked out the window. "Dad, where are we going?" she asked, her voice tinged with a slight edge of confusion. "I thought you said the garden was near the lake." I didn't look at her. I just kept my eyes on the road. "We are almost there, Harper. I just need to show you something first. It is a property I am considering for a new development project." I pulled the car into the gravel driveway of a small, dilapidated house with a bright orange foreclosure notice taped to the front door. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the porch steps were rotting. "This is it?" Harper asked, stepping out of the car and shielding her eyes from the harsh midday sun. "Why are we here, Dad? This place is a wreck." I didn't answer. I walked to the trunk, pulled out the heavy leather portfolio containing the truth, and gestured for her to follow me inside. I had the key. I had purchased this specific foreclosure 3 days ago through a shell company. It was the physical manifestation of the Lawson family's reality. We stepped into the living room. The air was thick with the smell of dust and stagnant moisture. There was no furniture, only a single rusted metal folding table I had placed in the center of the room. I set the leather portfolio on the table and opened it. Harper stood across from me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale with a growing instinctive dread. "Dad, you are starting to scare me," she whispered. "What is going on?" I looked at her, and for a fleeting second I wanted to stop. I wanted to take her home, tell her everything was fine, and let her keep her beautiful fake life. But I knew that if I didn't break her heart now, Trent would destroy her soul later. I reached into the folder and pulled out the deed to the Lincoln Park condo. "Read this," I commanded, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. She took the paper, her eyes scanning the text. Her hands began to shake as she realized her name was missing. "This must be a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "Trent said it was in a trust for tax purposes." I didn't give her a chance to breathe. I slid the second document across the table. "This is the second mortgage Trent took out on that condo 48 hours after I gave him the down payment. He didn't buy you a home, Harper. He used my gift to pay off his own creditors. And these," I said, dropping a thick stack of bank statements onto the metal table with a loud metallic bang, "are Trent's actual financial records. He is not a wealth manager. He is a disgraced broker who owes $4 million in margin debt. He is drowning, and he is using you as his life jacket." Harper staggered back, her back hitting the cold, unpainted wall. "No," she sobbed, shaking her head violently. "You are wrong. You are just trying to control me. You never liked him because he didn't come from a construction background. This is all just a lie." I reached for the final, most devastating document, the forged medical file from Preston's clinic. I held it out to her. "This is why he took me to see his father, Harper. They diagnosed me with Alzheimer's. They forged a second doctor's signature to make it legal. Trent had you sign a prenuptial agreement that gives him total power of attorney over my estate the moment a doctor declares me unfit. They were going to announce my illness at your wedding reception. They were going to use the public pressure to force me to sign away everything I have built, including your inheritance, to pay off their gambling debts." The silence in that empty, rotting house was deafening. Harper looked down at the forged diagnosis, her eyes tracing the words, "early onset Alzheimer's." She saw the signature of a doctor who was currently in Switzerland. She saw the cold, clinical plan to erase her father. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She collapsed onto her knees on the dusty floor, the papers fluttering around her like falling leaves. A raw, guttural scream of pure agony tore from her throat, a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. She wept with a violence that shook her entire frame, her dreams of a perfect life dissolving into the gray dust of that foreclosed room. I didn't move toward her. I knew I couldn't comfort her yet. She had to feel the full weight of the betrayal so that she would never be tempted to go back to him. I stood over the table, watching my daughter break into 1,000 pieces. After a long time, the screaming stopped, replaced by a hollow, ragged sobbing. She looked up at me, her makeup smeared her eyes red and filled with a terrifying, cold clarity I had never seen in her before. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Are we going to call the police?" I reached down and gripped the edge of the metal table. "No," I said, my voice as hard as the steel I used to build skyscrapers. "If we call the police, he goes to jail, but he remains a man in your memory. I want him to be a ghost. I have bought every penny of his debt, Harper. I am his master now. We are going to let the wedding proceed. We are going to let him stand at that altar. We are going to let him think he has won. And then in front of everyone he ever tried to impress, we are going to tear his world down to the foundation." "Are you with me?" Harper wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. Her eyes were no longer those of a bride. They were the eyes of a Caldwell. "Yes," she said firmly. "Let's finish this." I didn't move toward her immediately. I stood there, a silent witness to the total demolition of my daughter's heart. Harper's eyes were fixed on that forged medical file, her breathing coming in sharp, jagged gasps. It was as if the air in the room had turned to broken glass. She reached out her fingers, trembling so violently she could barely pick up the paper. She read the diagnosis again, then the forged signature, then the clause in the prenuptial agreement that effectively signed my life away to the man she was supposed to marry in 72 hours. The realization hit her with the force of a high-speed collision. She didn't just cry. She shattered. She let out a sound I will never forget. It was a raw, primal wail of pure agony that echoed off the bare, rotting walls of that foreclosed house. She fell back against the wall, sliding down until she was curled in a ball on the dusty floorboards. My beautiful, confident daughter was gone, replaced by a broken girl who had just realized the love of her life was actually a predator. She began to sob with a violence that shook her entire frame, her hands clutching her head as if trying to hold her world together. "Trent," she choked out between gasps. "How could he? How could they do this to you? They were going to tell the world you were losing your mind. They were going to lock you away." The sobbing continued for several minutes, a relentless outpouring of grief and shock. I stayed exactly where I was, letting her feel every ounce of the betrayal. I knew it was cruel, but she needed to be vaccinated against his lies. If she didn't feel the full weight of this pain now, she might succumb to his charm later. After a while, the sobbing turned into a sharp, hysterical laughter. She looked up at me, her makeup running in dark streaks down her face, her eyes wild with a sudden burning rage. "That's it," she spat, her voice cracking. "It's over. I am going to destroy him." She lunged for her purse, her fingers frantically digging through it until she found her phone. Her thumbs flew across the screen with a desperate, manic energy. "I am calling him right now," she screamed, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "I am going to tell him I know everything. I'm calling the police. I'm calling the caterers. I'm going on social media and I am going to post every single one of these documents. I will make sure everyone in Chicago knows that Trent Lawson is a pathetic, thieving fraud. He won't be able to show his face in this city ever again." She was hysterical, her finger hovering over the dial button, her face flushed a deep, angry red. Before she could press the button, I stepped forward and firmly took the phone from her hand. "No, Harper?" I said, my voice low and steady like the sound of a heavy door closing. "We are not doing that." "Give it back," she shrieked, reaching for the device. "I have to stop him. The wedding is in 3 days. I can't look at him. I can't let him near me. We have to cancel everything. I want him gone. I want him in jail." I held the phone high above her reach, and looked her directly in the eyes. I needed her to see the cold iron resolve that had built a construction empire. Harper, listen to me very carefully, I commanded. If you call him now, he wins. If you cancel this wedding on a Wednesday afternoon via a phone call. Trent Lawson walks away with his dignity mostly intact. He will tell his friends and his creditors that you had a nervous breakdown. He will claim your aging father manipulated you. He will move on to his next victim, and he will never truly feel the weight of what he tried to do to us. He will escape into the shadows, and he will play the victim for the rest of his life. I walked over to the rusted folding table and tapped the heavy leather portfolio. Is that what you want? I asked. Do you want him to just go away? Or do you want him to be destroyed? Because if we cancel now, he just walks out the door. But if we wait, we own him. I have bought every single dollar of his debt, Harper. I am the man who owns his house, his car, and his future. He thinks he is walking into a wedding where he will become a king. He has no idea he is actually walking into a trap that has already been sprung. Harper stopped struggling. She stood there in the center of that derelict room, her chest heaving, her eyes slowly beginning to clear as my words sank in. She looked at the foreclosure notice on the door, then back at the documents on the table. You want to let the wedding happen? She whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and dawning realization. You want me to stand there and look at him, to let him touch my hand, to let him think I'm still his fool? I nodded slowly. It will be the hardest thing you have ever done, I said. But on Saturday, when he stands up to deliver that speech, when he thinks he is about to seize everything I worked for, we are going to pull the floor out from under him in front of every person he has ever lied to. We are going to strip him of his pride, his money, and his freedom all at once. We are going to give him a public execution that he will never recover from. I handed her phone back to her. If you want to cancel, do it now, I said. I will support you. We will go home and we will hide. But if you want justice, real justice, then put that phone in your purse. Go home. Wash your face. When Trent calls you tonight to talk about the guest list, you're going to sound like the happiest bride in the world. You are going to be the best actress Chicago has ever seen. Because on Saturday, the curtain falls for the Lawsons. Harper stared at the phone in her hand for a long time. The silence in the house was heavy, filled with the ghosts of the family that once lived there. Finally, she took a deep breath, her jaw tightening into a line of pure Caldwell steel. She turned the phone off and slid it into her bag. She looked at me, and for the first time since we entered this house, the tears had stopped. Tell me exactly what I need to do, she said. I didn't raise a victim. I raised a survivor. And Trent Lawson was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to tear down a house built on a rock. I didn't raise a victim. I raised a survivor. And Trent Lawson was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to tear down a house built on a rock. Harper stood there, her breathing finally leveling out, her eyes fixed on the cold, gray floorboards of the abandoned house. The silence was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I walked over to her and placed my hands firmly on her shoulders. I needed her to look at me not as her father who provides, but as her partner in this war. Listen to me, Harper, I said, my voice low and resonant. We have already spent over $150,000 on this wedding. Between the venue, the flowers, the catering, and the music, I have paid for the most expensive stage in Chicago. We are not going to waste it by running away. Most people would call the police and spend the next 3 years in a messy, quiet courtroom while Trent's lawyers spin stories. But that is not the Caldwell way. We are going to use that stage. We are going to let them walk right into the center of the spotlight they so desperately crave. And then we are going to pull the floor out from under them in front of every single person they have ever tried to impress. Harper wiped the last of the salt from her cheeks, her jaw tightening. But how can I even look at him, Dad? Every time he touches my hand, I am going to feel like I am being crawled on by a snake. Every time he says he loves me, I will know he is just calculating the value of your estate. I don't know if I can smile through that. It feels impossible. I squeezed her shoulders, looking directly into her eyes. You turn that pain into leverage, I told her. You use that feeling of being crawled on to remind yourself why we are doing this. When he smiles at you, you don't see a husband. You see a target. You are going to be the most beautiful, radiant, and happy bride anyone has ever seen. You are going to be so convincing that Trent and Preston will feel absolutely invincible. That is the key, Harper. For this to work, they have to believe they have already won. We need them to be so arrogant and so comfortable that they don't even look for the trap. I led her back to the rusted metal table and pointed to the leather portfolio. Tonight, when you go home, you are going to call Trent. You are going to tell him you had a wonderful day with me. You are going to tell him how excited you are for Saturday. If he asks about the wedding breakfast, you tell him the garden was beautiful and that you can't wait for your new life together to start. You are going to play the part of the naive, blinded girl he thinks you are. You are going to give him every single thing he wants to hear. And tomorrow at the rehearsal dinner, you are going to sit next to him and hold his hand. You are going to toast to the Lawson family name. You are going to let Preston feel like he is the king of the world. Harper took a deep breath, her chest expanding with a new icy resolve. And what about the wedding? What happens when we are standing at the altar? I smiled, a cold, thin expression that held no warmth. The wedding will proceed exactly as planned. We will let the music play. We will let the guests take their seats. We will let Trent prepare his little surprise speech. Victor and Bradley are already coordinating with the authorities. Everything is timed to the second. When he stands up to announce my supposed illness, when he pulls out that power of attorney and thinks he is about to seize the Caldwell legacy, that is when we strike. I have purchased every cent of his debt, Harper. I am the man who holds his mortgage and his margin calls. I am his master, and he doesn't even know it yet. In that moment in front of the banks, the elite of Chicago and the cameras, we are going to hand him 2 envelopes, one for the son and one for the father. I watched as the realization settled over her. She wasn't just understanding the plan. She was embracing it. The grief that had paralyzed her minutes ago was being forged into a weapon. She reached out and touched the leather folder, her fingers steady. "You want me to be the bait," she whispered. "I want you to be the hunter," I corrected her. "You are a Caldwell. We don't get used. We don't get cheated. And we certainly do not get humiliated in our own city. We are going to teach the Lawsons a lesson about what happens when you try to build a life on a foundation of lies. By the time the sun sets on Saturday, Trent will be homeless, bankrupt, and disgraced. His father will be a pariah in the medical community. They will lose everything, not just your money, but their freedom and their names." Harper looked around the derelict house one last time. This crumbling, foreclosed wreck was the truth of the Lawson family. This was the future they had planned for us. She turned back to me and nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "I can do it, Dad. I will smile. I will be the perfect bride. I will make sure they don't suspect a thing. I want to see the look on his face when he realizes you own him. I want to be the one who hands him the envelope." "Good," I said, closing the leather portfolio and tucking it under my arm. "Then the alliance is forged. We have 48 hours to play our parts. We go back to the city now. You go to your final fitting. You act like the world is perfect. I will handle the legal finality of their destruction." We walked out of the cold, dusty house and back into the bright Chicago sun. As I locked the door of the foreclosed property, I felt a strange sense of peace. The betrayal was absolute, but so was the coming retribution. We climbed into the car, and for the first time in days, the air between us was clear. We were no longer a father protecting a daughter. We were 2 partners standing on a rock, watching the tide come in to sweep away the sand. The Lawsons thought they were invited to a wedding. They had no idea they were attending a funeral for their own lives. I started the engine and pulled out of the gravel driveway, heading back toward the skyscrapers that I had helped build and the justice that I was about to deliver. The following evening, the air in the private dining room of the Peninsula Hotel was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. I sat at the head of a long mahogany table surrounded by 30 of the most influential people in Chicago. To my right sat Harper, her face a mask of porcelain perfection. To my left sat Trent, looking smug in a silk suit that I had essentially paid for through the debt I now owned. Across from us, Preston stood up, tapping a crystal spoon against his wine glass. The room fell silent. He cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles with a slow, deliberate movement that screamed of a man who believed he had finally reached the summit of his ambition. "I want to propose a toast," Preston began, his voice booming with a hollow, theatrical authority. "We are here tonight to celebrate the union of two families. But more importantly, we are here to acknowledge a transition." He turned his gaze toward me, and I saw the glint of predatory triumph in his eyes. Richard Caldwell is a man of the earth. He built an empire with his bare hands through decades of grueling, hard manual labor. And while we all admire that grit, we must also be realistic. That kind of life takes a heavy toll on a man. It wears down the body, and eventually it wears down the sharpest of minds. A murmur went through the room. I felt Harper's hand tighten under the table, her knuckles likely turning white. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes focused on my plate, slowly and methodically, cutting a small piece of ribeye steak. I let my hand tremble just a fraction of an inch, enough for the people closest to me to notice. I wanted them to see exactly what Preston wanted them to see. I was the aging lion, toothless and tired, ready to be led to the pasture. Preston continued, his tone dripping with a condescension so thick it was nauseating. "We have noticed lately that our dear Richard is getting a bit tired. The fog of a long life is starting to roll in. But the beauty of family is that when the captain can no longer see the horizon, new officers step up to take the wheel. Trent and I have discussed this at length. We are prepared to shoulder the burden. We are going to steer the Caldwell ship into calmer waters, ensuring that Richard's legacy is protected from his own fading strength. We are taking over the heavy lifting now, so Richard can finally rest in the quiet shadows he has earned. To the future of the Lawson and Caldwell interests, now under one unified, capable management." He raised his glass, and the room followed suit. I heard the clinking of crystal, a sound that usually signifies celebration, but tonight it sounded like the locking of a cage. I picked up my own glass, my movements slow and deliberate. I took a small sip, then let out a shallow, shaky breath. "Thank you, Preston," I whispered loud enough for the table to hear. "Your words are very comforting. It is a relief to know I don't have to worry anymore." Trent leaned over and squeezed my arm, his grip a little too tight, a little too possessive. "Don't you worry about a thing, Dad," he whispered in my ear. "Tomorrow after the ceremony, we will sit down and finalize everything. We will make it all official. You can just sit back and enjoy the music." I looked at him and forced a weak, grateful smile. "You are a good man, Trent. Harper is lucky to have you." Beside me, Harper was a revelation. She didn't flinch. She didn't glare. She played the role of the stressed, overwhelmed bride to absolute perfection. She leaned her head on Trent's shoulder, looking up at him with eyes that seemed full of adoration, but I knew were actually cold with calculation. She thanked Preston for his beautiful words, her voice slightly breathless, as if she were on the verge of happy tears. She was so convincing that for a moment even I was stunned by her resolve. We were two ghosts at our own feast, watching our enemies celebrate a victory they hadn't actually won. The rest of the dinner was an exercise in extreme restraint. I listened to Preston brag about his family's ancient lineage, knowing full well his bank accounts were empty. I watched Trent whisper to a guest about a new investment fund he was launching, knowing he was actually drowning in $4 million of debt that I now controlled. Every time they laughed, every time they looked at me with that patronizing pity, I felt the iron in my spine grow stronger. They thought they were the hunters, and I was the trophy. They had no idea that the room was already surrounded. I spent the evening playing the part of the fading patriarch. I drifted in and out of conversations, occasionally asking the same question twice just to reinforce their narrative. I saw the knowing glances exchanged between Trent and his father. They were so confident in their prey that they had stopped being careful. They were already spending the money in their heads. They were already dividing up the properties I had spent 40 years acquiring. They were so blinded by their own greed that they couldn't see the cold, hard reality standing right in front of them. As the dinner ended and the guests began to depart, Preston walked over to me one last time. He leaned in close, the smell of expensive cognac on his breath. "Sleep well tonight, Richard," he said with a smirk. "Tomorrow is going to be a very big day for all of us." I reached out and shook his hand, feeling the softness of a man who had never done a day of real work in his life. "Yes, Preston," I replied, my voice steady and quiet. "Tomorrow is going to be a day that none of us will ever forget." I watched them leave the hotel, their shadows long and arrogant on the sidewalk. I turned to Harper, who was standing by the window looking out at the Chicago skyline. She looked at me and the mask finally dropped. Her eyes were like flint. "Are you ready?" she asked. I adjusted my jacket and felt the weight of the 2 envelopes in my inner pocket. The legal trap was set. The debt was purchased. The authorities were briefed. Everything was in place for the final act. I took my daughter's hand and led her toward the door. "I am ready," I said. "Let's go give them the wedding they deserve." I adjusted my jacket and felt the weight of the 2 envelopes in my inner pocket. "I am ready," I said. "Let's go give them the wedding they deserve." But before we could even make it to the elevators of the peninsula, I felt a heavy, possessive hand drop onto my shoulder. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Trent. I could smell his expensive, overbearing cologne, the scent of a man who spent more time in front of a mirror than he ever did on a job site. Harper gave my hand a quick, meaningful squeeze before stepping away toward the ladies' room, leaving me alone with the man who thought he had already dismantled my life. Trent leaned in close, guided me toward a quiet corner of the bar where the shadows were deeper and the music was just a faint hum. He leaned against the polished brass rail, looking down at me with a smirk that was so patronizing it made my skin crawl. "Hey there, big guy," he said, his voice dropping into that slow, rhythmic cadence one might use to soothe a frightened child or a confused animal. "I noticed you looked a little overwhelmed during my father's toast. It was a lot to take in, wasn't it? All those big words and talk about the future." I didn't answer right away. I let my gaze wander aimlessly toward the rows of crystal bottles behind the bar, pretending to struggle with the simple task of focusing my eyes. I let my mouth hang open just a fraction, projecting the image of a man whose thoughts were drifting like autumn leaves in a gust of wind. "Yeah," I mumbled, rubbing my chin with a slightly trembling hand. "It was very nice. Preston is a very smart man. He sounds like he knows exactly what to do." Trent chuckled, a dry, metallic sound that held no genuine warmth. He reached out and straightened my tie, his fingers lingering near my throat for a second longer than necessary. "He does, Rick. He really does. And I want you to listen to me very carefully. Tomorrow, after you walk Harper down the aisle, we are going to have a little celebration. And during that celebration, I am going to bring you some papers. Now, I don't want you to get all flustered or worried about the legal jargon. They are just big, confusing documents that help us take care of the boring stuff, so you don't have to. You trust me, don't you? You know I'm going to look after your interests." I looked up at him, forcing a watery, vacant look into my eyes. "You'll take care of the taxes?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "And the properties?" "I don't think I can keep track of the maintenance schedules anymore, Trent. It's all getting so complicated. The numbers just keep moving around on the page. Trent's smile widened, revealing a row of teeth that looked like they belonged on a shark. Exactly, Rick. The numbers are moving because you've worked too hard. You've done your time. Tomorrow you just need to put your name on the bottom line. It's like signing a guest book at a party. Very simple. Very easy. I'll be right there to hold the pen for you. Then we can go back to the party and you can have a nice long rest. He patted my cheek, twice, a gesture so insulting it felt like a physical strike. I'll see you at the church, big guy. Get some sleep. You look like you need it. I watched him walk away, his gait confident, his head held high with the arrogance of a man who believed he had just successfully outmaneuvered a legend. I stood there by the bar, the cool marble beneath my hand, the only thing keeping me grounded. Inside, a storm of pure, concentrated rage was howling. It took every single ounce of discipline I had spent 70 years accumulating not to reach out, grab him by his silk lapels, and drive my fist through his perfect porcelain teeth. I have spent my entire life in the company of men who measure their worth in sweat and steel. I have stood on the girders of skyscrapers 1,000 feet above the pavement, and I have stared down union thugs who tried to burn my equipment. I have survived recessions, betrayals, and the crushing weight of grief. And yet this boy, this spoiled, entitled child, who had never known the weight of a hammer or the bite of a Chicago winter, thought he could speak to me like I was a broken toy. He saw the white hair and the slow walk, and he assumed the brain inside had softened into mush. It is a peculiar kind of arrogance that young men like Trent possess. They think that because the world has gone on to digital screens and paper shuffling, the old rules of strength and survival no longer apply. They see old age as a disability rather than a strategic advantage. They don't understand that a man who has lived 70 years has seen every trick, heard every lie, and felt every kind of pain. They don't realize that the reason I am still standing is because I am more dangerous than they will ever be. Trent Lawson thought he was the hunter. He thought he was luring a confused old sheep into a pen so he could shear it for everything it was worth. He had no idea that he was actually cornering a wolf that had been waiting for him to get close enough to catch the scent of his fear. Every patronizing word he spoke was just another nail I was going to hammer into his coffin. Every time he patted my shoulder, he was just making it easier for me to find his pressure points. I turned away from the bar and walked toward the lobby. My steps still slow, my eyes still fixed on the floor. I saw Harper waiting for me by the revolving doors. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for a sign. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The fire was burning behind my ribs, cold and bright. Tomorrow, Trent wanted a show. He wanted a public display of my decline so he could justify his theft. Well, I was going to give him a show, but it wasn't the one he had rehearsed. I was going to show him exactly what a Chicago bricklayer does when he finds a crack in the foundation. I was going to bring the whole house down on top of him. I stood in the silence of my bedroom, staring at the darkened Chicago skyline, waiting for the final signal. At exactly 11 o'clock, my secure phone vibrated against the mahogany nightstand. I picked it up, hearing the familiar low rasp of Victor's voice. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The link is live, Rick," he said. "Bradley and I have finalized the handoff." I sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the moment. "Tell me everything," I commanded. Victor began to list the coordinates of our strike with the cold precision of a military briefing. "We didn't just dump the files," Victor explained. "We delivered them directly into the hands of the people who have been waiting for a reason to move." The SEC has been tracking the irregularities in Trent's former brokerage accounts for months, but they were missing the direct link to the offshore shell company. When Bradley submitted the wire transfer records and the debt acquisition contracts from your Delaware entity, it provided the missing piece of the puzzle. They now have undeniable proof of securities fraud and embezzlement. They aren't just going to fine him, Rick. They have already authorized a federal warrant for his arrest. They are treating this as a high-priority case of predatory financial crime. I closed my eyes, picturing Trent's smug face at the bar earlier that evening. He thought he was so clever hiding his tracks behind offshore trusts, never imagining that the man he was trying to rob would be the one to hand the keys to the federal government. "And what about Preston?" I asked, my voice steady. Victor let out a short, dry chuckle. "That was even easier." Bradley spent the afternoon with the legal counsel for the Illinois Medical Board. When they saw the forged signature of the neurologist who is currently in Switzerland, coupled with your recording of the fabricated cognitive exam, the board moved into an emergency session. They have already issued a summary suspension of Preston's medical license. It is effective immediately. They have also notified the state's attorney's office regarding the felony medical forgery. Preston Lawson is no longer a doctor, and by tomorrow afternoon he will be a prime suspect in a criminal conspiracy investigation. Bradley joined the call, his voice sharp and professional. "The timing is locked in, Rick. We have coordinated with the local authorities to ensure maximum impact. The SEC agents and the local police are briefed to arrive at the church at exactly 2:15 tomorrow afternoon. That should be right at the peak of the reception, just as Trent plans to deliver his little speech and pull out the power of attorney documents. We wanted to give him enough rope to hang himself publicly before the handcuffs go on. I want him to stand on that stage. I want him to look at the guests, and I want him to believe for one final glorious second that he has won everything. I want the fall to be as long and as painful as possible." I thanked them both and hung up the phone. The room felt colder now, filled with the presence of the trap I had spent the last week meticulously arming. I walked over to the closet and pulled out my tuxedo for the morning. I brushed a stray piece of lint off the shoulder, my movements calm and methodical. To any outsider, I was just a proud, aging father, preparing for his daughter's big day. But inside, I was a man who had just finished building a cage. I sat back down at my desk and opened the leather portfolio one last time. I looked at the 2 envelopes I had prepared. One was thick with the debt acquisition papers and the foreclosure notice for the condo. The other contained the evidence of the medical forgery and the suspension notice from the board. These were the physical manifestations of my justice. I tucked them into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket, patting the fabric to make sure they were secure. They felt heavy against my chest, a reminder of the burden I had carried since that night at the Ritz. I thought about Harper sleeping in her apartment, probably staring at the ceiling, just like I was. We had made a pact in that rotting, foreclosed house, and tomorrow was the day we would see it through. I knew the public humiliation would be difficult for her, but I also knew it was the only way to truly set her free. She needed to see the monster fully unmasked in the light of day so that she could never doubt her decision to leave him. We were going to give the city of Chicago a story they would talk about for decades. The arrogance of the Lawsons was their ultimate undoing. They saw a man with white hair and assumed he was a relic of a forgotten era. They thought that because I valued hard work and loyalty, I was too soft for the modern world of digital theft and legal manipulation. They forgot that you don't build a construction empire in this city by being weak. You build it by knowing how to handle the pressure, how to read the cracks in a foundation, and how to strike when the structure is most vulnerable. I turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness for a long time. The city lights twinkled outside, indifferent to the drama that was about to unfold. Tomorrow, Trent and Preston would walk into that church thinking they were the masters of the universe. They would smile for the cameras, drink the expensive champagne I had paid for, and prepare to seize my life's work. They had no idea that at 2:15 the world was going to stop turning for them. I wasn't just defending my money. I was defending the honor of every person who has ever been treated like a fool because of their age. I closed my eyes and finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all that was left was the execution. The sun rose over Chicago with a cruel golden clarity. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, the silence of the house weighing heavy on my shoulders. I reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo, feeling the sharp edges of the 2 envelopes. They were tucked securely against my chest, right where my heart used to beat with a father's pride. Now they were just heavy with the weight of the justice I was about to deliver. I walked out of the house, drove to the grand stone cathedral in the heart of the city, and prepared to watch my daughter walk into a den of wolves. The church was a masterpiece of intimidation. High society guests in silk and wool filled every pew. My former business associates, men who had helped me build this city, sat in the front rows, their faces etched with a mixture of respect and curiosity. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 white lilies and the soft haunting melody of a string quartet. It was a scene of absolute pristine perfection. I stood at the back of the sanctuary, watching the sunlight filter through the stained glass, casting long, bloody streaks of crimson across the marble floor. Then the music changed. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the congregation stood as one. Harper appeared framed by the bright light of the afternoon. She was breathtaking. Her $15,000 gown trailed behind her like a silk shroud, her face hidden behind a delicate lace veil. To the guests, she looked like a beautiful, nervous bride. To me, she looked like an angel of death. She met my eyes for a fraction of a second, and I saw the cold iron resolve we had forged in that rotting, foreclosed house. She wasn't walking toward a marriage. She was walking toward an execution. I took her arm, and together we began the long walk down the center aisle. Every step felt like a mile. I could feel the eyes of the city on us whispering about the Caldwell legacy and the fortunate young man waiting at the altar. Trent stood there looking like a prince in his charcoal suit, his face a mask of humble, practiced devotion. Beside him, Preston stood tall, his chest puffed out with the arrogance of a man who believed he had finally secured his retirement on the backs of my hard work. I handed Harper's hand to Trent, felt the dry, cold skin of his palm, and then took my seat in the front row. The ceremony proceeded with agonizing precision. The priest spoke of love sacrifice and the union of two souls, but just as the time came for the exchange of vows, the rhythm of the ritual was shattered. Trent didn't reach for the rings. Instead, he stepped toward the lectern and grabbed the microphone. A confused murmur rippled through the pews. He held up a hand calling for silence and turned his gaze toward me. His face suddenly transformed. The joy vanished, replaced by a look of profound, theatrical sorrow. "Friends, family, honored guests," Trent began, his voice amplified and echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "I am so sorry to interrupt this sacred moment. But before Harper and I take these vows, there is a matter of urgent, heartbreaking importance that we must address. It is a matter of family, of duty, and of protection." He paused, letting the tension in the room tighten until it was almost unbearable. He looked directly at me, and I saw the glort of pure predatory triumph in his eyes. "Most of you know Richard Caldwell as a giant of industry." Trent continued, his voice dripping with a fake, syrupy sympathy. "But behind closed doors, we have seen a different reality. For months, we have watched a brilliant mind begin to fade. We have watched a hero lose his way in the fog of a devastating illness. Preston and I have kept this secret to protect his dignity, but we can no longer stand by while he remains vulnerable." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick legal document, holding it up for the entire church to see. "This is a medical diagnosis from one of the top clinics in the state," Trent announced, his voice rising with a manufactured passion. "Richard is suffering from a rapid, progressive cognitive decline. He is no longer capable of managing the vast complexity of his estate. And so, as his new family, we have prepared a solution." He looked at me, his smile widening into something truly monstrous. "Rick, I need you to come up here. For your own good, and for the protection of Harper's future, I need you to sign this durable power of attorney. Right now, in front of your friends and the God we serve, let us take this burden from you. Let us save the family." The church went deathly silent. I could hear the heavy rhythmic ticking of the clock in the vestibule. I saw the shocked faces of my friends, the gasps of the socialites, and the pale, terrified expression on my daughter's face as she played her part. Preston stepped forward, nodding solemnly, playing the role of the grieving doctor to perfection. They had done it. They had staged the ultimate ambush. They had used the sanctity of the altar and the presence of the elite to create a pressure cooker I was supposed to crack under. Trent held the pen out to me, his eyes burning with a feverish greed. "Come on, Rick," he whispered into the microphone, his tone patronizing and slow. "Don't be afraid. Just sign the paper so we can get back to the celebration. Everyone here wants you to be safe. Just put your name on the bottom line. It's the right thing to do." I sat perfectly still for 3 long seconds. I let the humiliation wash over me. I let the guests see the broken old man. And then I stood up, but I didn't move like a man with a failing mind. I stood with the straight, unbreakable posture of a man who had spent 40 years commanding thousands of workers. I felt the weight of the 2 envelopes in my pocket, and I realized that the time for silence was over. The trap was fully armed, the bait had been swallowed, and the Lawsons were standing exactly where I wanted them. I stepped into the aisle and began to walk toward the altar, but I wasn't walking toward a pen. I was walking toward the end of their lives. I stepped into the aisle and began to walk toward the altar, but I wasn't walking toward a pen. I was walking toward the end of their lives. The church was so quiet, you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning vents high above. Every eye was fixed on me, waiting for the stumble, waiting for the vacant stare of a man who didn't know where he was. Trent stood there with the pen extended, a smug, encouraging smile plastered on his face. He actually reached out to steady my elbow, as if I were a toddler taking my first steps. I stopped exactly 1 foot in front of him. I didn't take the pen. Instead, I straightened my back. I felt the joints in my spine pop as I shed the fake frailty I had been wearing like a heavy coat for the last 3 days. I looked Trent directly in the eyes, and I watched his smile falter. The pity in his gaze was replaced by a sudden flickering confusion. I didn't look like a man with a failing mind. I looked like the man who had built half the skyline visible through the cathedral windows. "Trent," I said, my voice projecting with the deep, gravelly authority of a site foreman, "your concern for my health is truly touching, but I think there has been a slight misunderstanding." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the microphone he was still holding. I didn't grab it. I simply leaned down and spoke into it, my voice echoing through the massive stone sanctuary. "I am not the one who is in trouble today." The murmurs in the pews grew louder. I saw Preston take a nervous step forward, his face beginning to redden. Harper, who had been standing like a statue beside Trent, finally moved. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply reached out, took Trent's hand, and uncurled his fingers. She slid the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. It caught the light of the stained glass, flashing a brilliant cold blue. She didn't say a word. She just dropped the ring into Trent's breast pocket with a soft metallic clink. Trent's mouth hung open. He looked at Harper, then at me, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Rick, what are you doing?" he hissed, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain his composure for the guests. "You're confused. The medication. We talked about this." I reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket. I felt the weight of the 2 thick manila envelopes. I pulled them out slowly, letting the entire congregation see the official seals of the law firms and the government agencies. I didn't look at the crowd. I kept my eyes on the 2 predators standing on the altar. "I have a few gifts for you, Trent," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Since you were so worried about my estate, I decided to do some shopping of my own." I held up the first envelope. "This one is for you. It contains the legal notice that an anonymous Delaware entity has successfully purchased every single dollar of your margin debt from your former brokerage and your private lenders. I am now your sole creditor, Trent. I own your $4 million liability. I also own the second mortgage on the Lincoln Park condo. Since you defaulted on the payment terms this morning, I have already filed for immediate foreclosure. You are officially bankrupt. You are homeless. And by the time the sun sets tonight, I will have frozen every asset you have ever touched." Trent staggered back, his hand hitting the flower arrangement. He looked like he was about to vomit. The guests in the front row stood up, their faces filled with shock. But I wasn't finished. I turned my gaze toward Preston, who looked as though he were having a stroke. "And for the good doctor," I said, handing him the second envelope. "This contains the summary suspension of your medical license from the Illinois Medical Board. It also includes the sworn affidavit from the neurologist in Switzerland, whose signature you forged on my medical records. The state's attorney's office has already been notified of the felony medical forgery you committed in your own clinic. You aren't going to be managing anyone's estate, Preston. You'll be lucky if you aren't eating prison food by the end of the month." The church exploded into chaos. My business associates were whispering loudly, some of them checking their phones. Preston ripped open the envelope. His hands shaking so violently, the papers fluttered to the floor. Trent tried to grab Harper's arm, but she stepped back, her face a mask of absolute freezing contempt. She looked at the man she had almost married and spoke for the first time. "You didn't just try to rob my father, Trent. You tried to kill him while he was still alive. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" I watched the realization sink in. They had walked into this church thinking they were the masters of a grand manipulation. They thought they were the smartest people in the room because they were young and ruthless. They had completely forgotten that you don't build a life on a foundation of lies and expect it to stand. I stood there, the envelopes empty in my hands, feeling a strange, hollow sense of relief. The public humiliation was absolute. The financial destruction was complete. Trent looked at the crowd, his eyes wild, looking for a way out. But there were no exits left. He had spent his entire life building a cage for me, only to realize that I had used his own iron to lock him inside. He looked at me, his lip trembling, all the fake charm and the syrupy warmth gone. "Rick, please," he whispered. "We can talk about this." I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. I turned to my daughter and offered her my arm. She took it, her grip firm and steady. We didn't wait for the priest to finish. We didn't wait for the police to arrive at the door. We simply turned our backs on the altar and began to walk back down the aisle. We walked past the shocked socialites, past the cameras, and past the ruins of the Lawson family. As we reached the heavy oak doors, I felt the cool afternoon air on my face. The trap had been sprung, the debt had been collected, and for the first time in a week, I could finally breathe. I wasn't just a father protecting a daughter. I was a Caldwell, and in this city we always finish what we start. I turned my back on the altar and began to walk back down the aisle, but the silence behind me didn't last long. I heard the frantic ruffling of paper as Trent tore into the first envelope. I stopped, turned around slowly, and looked at him. His face was no longer gray. It was a sickly, translucent white. He looked at the legal headers, the bank seals, and the signature on the debt transfer. He looked like a man watching his own execution. I stepped back toward the microphone, my movements fluid and full of a power he had never seen. "I bought your $4 million debt, Trent," I said, my voice echoing through the stone arches of the cathedral. "Every penny you owed to the brokerage, every cent you owed to the private lenders. I own it all. And since you defaulted on the terms of your margin calls this morning, I have officially frozen the stolen condo. I have already filed the paperwork. You are bankrupt, you are destitute, and as of this moment, you are officially homeless." The guests gasped. A few of my old construction partners stood up, their faces filled with a grim satisfaction. They knew what it meant to play a game with me and lose. Trent tried to speak, but his throat seemed to have closed up. He looked down at the ring Harper had dropped in his pocket, then back at the foreclosure notice. The smug prince of Chicago was gone. In his place stood a broken, hollow fraud. Preston tried to step forward, his face flushed with a desperate, cowardly rage. "Richard, you cannot do this," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. This is a family matter. You are sick. You are delusional. We are trying to help you. I didn't flinch. I reached back into my pocket and pulled out the second envelope. I held it out to him, and for a second he hesitated. He knew what was inside. He could feel the weight of his own crimes pressing down on him. And for the good doctor, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that the microphone carried to every corner of the room. This is for you. It is a copy of your federal indictment for Medicare fraud, which my investigators uncovered while looking into your shady clinic finances. It also contains the official notice from the Illinois Medical Board. Your medical license has been revoked, Preston. You aren't a physician anymore. You are just a common forger who tried to erase a man's life to cover his own tracks. Preston grabbed the envelope, his hands shaking so violently that the thick paper rattled. He pulled out the documents, and as he read the words, revoked and indictment, he literally slumped against the altar. The two of them looked like statues of defeated men, surrounded by the expensive flowers and the high society guests they had tried so hard to impress. The illusion was gone. The Lawson legacy was a pile of ash. Right then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral swung open with a resounding bang. The sunlight flooded in, silhouetting the figures of 4 men in dark suits and 2 uniformed officers. They didn't run. They walked down the center aisle with a steady, inevitable rhythm. The lead agent held up a badge. Federal Bureau of Investigation, he announced, his voice flat and professional. Trent Lawson, you are under arrest for securities fraud and embezzlement. Preston Lawson, you are being detained in connection with a federal investigation into medical forgery and insurance fraud. The church was dead silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. Every guest sat frozen in their pews, watching the ultimate payoff of a week of secret warfare. I watched as the officers stepped onto the altar. I watched as they turned Trent around and clicked the steel handcuffs onto his wrists. He didn't fight. He just looked at the floor, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. They did the same to Preston, who looked as though he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. As they were being led down the aisle past the rows of shocked socialites and the people they had lied to, Trent looked at me one last time. There was no more patronizing smile. There was only a hollow, pathetic fear. I didn't say a word. I just stood there next to my daughter, my arm linked firmly with hers. We watched them go. We watched the predator and his father being dragged out of the sanctuary they had tried to turn into a crime scene. When the doors finally closed behind them, the silence in the church felt different. It was no longer heavy with tension. It was light, as if a great weight had been lifted from the building. I walked back to the lectern and took the microphone one final time. I looked out at the guests, at my friends, and at the people who had come to see a wedding, but ended up witnessing a reckoning. I want to apologize to all of you for the interruption, I said, my voice calm and steady. I know this isn't the ceremony you expected, but today we aren't celebrating a wedding. We are celebrating the successful removal of a parasite from my daughter's life. We are celebrating the truth. My daughter is a Caldwell, and she deserves a life built on a foundation of honesty, not a pile of stolen money and forged medical records. I paused, looking at Harper. She stood tall, her veil pushed back, her eyes bright, with a new fierce independence. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the woman I had always known she could be. The $150,000 reception at the Ritz-Carlton is still fully paid for, I announced to the crowd. There is an open bar, a 5-course meal, and a band that has been paid to play all night. The only thing missing is the Lawson family. I suggest we all head over there and have a real celebration. Let's go eat. A few seconds passed, and then one by one the guests began to stand. My old business partners started to clap a low rhythm that grew into a standing ovation. They weren't clapping for a wedding. They were clapping for the man who had defended his family. They were clapping for the bricklayer who had proven he still knew how to protect what he built. Later that night, as the party at the Ritz roared on in the distance, I stood on the balcony of my home looking out at the city I loved. Harper was inside, finally laughing again, surrounded by friends who actually cared for her. I thought about the week that had passed. I thought about the cold, dusty floor of that foreclosed house and the sickening feeling of hearing those two men plot my demise in a bathroom. I looked at my hands. They were old and the skin was thin, but they were still strong. I realized then that the Lawsons had made a fatal mistake that many young, ambitious people make. They looked at the white hair and the slow walk, and they saw a target. They saw an expiration date. They mistook my silence for weakness and my kindness for stupidity. They didn't realize that a man who has built a life over 70 years hasn't just accumulated money. He has accumulated experience, patience, and a very specific kind of ruthlessness that only comes with knowing what is truly worth fighting for. Family isn't just about blood. It is about the people who stand by you when the foundation starts to shake. It is about the daughter who finds the strength to face the truth, and the father who is willing to burn down the world to keep her safe. I had spent millions of dollars to buy a noose for Trent Lawson, and I didn't regret a single penny. Money can be rebuilt. Steel can be replaced. But a man's dignity and his daughter's safety are priceless. The ultimate lesson I learned this week is one I hope the city never forgets. Never mistake an old man's silence for weakness. We aren't quiet because we have nothing to say. We are quiet because we are listening. We are watching. And if you try to take what we have built, we will be the last thing you ever see coming. I walked back into the house, closed the glass door against the Chicago wind, and finally let myself smile. The Caldwell house was still standing, and the foundation had never been stronger.